Hey, time out. I'm not religious, but I think Christianity's message is pretty positive. Well, Denarian, I want to say thanks because that makes me feel warm and fuzzy, and that's like the complete opposite of what my junior college prof told me all the time about how Christianity was predominantly negative. So, which is it? Good or bad? We should talk about it right now. Hey everyone, my name is Josh. Welcome to Overtime, a series of videos where we look at some of the most popular comments in the comment section on our Timeout series and do a deep dive to unpack the conversation a bit more and have some dialogue. A common stone thrown against Christianity is that its overall influence on society has been negative. People will cite examples like the Crusades and talk about how Christianity as a whole tends to be oppressive and isn't good for the world.
But in this universe, Christianity never existed, which means the dark ages of scientific repression never occurred, and thus humanity is 1,000 years more advanced.
This is an important topic for us to consider because we know that Christianity has been around for 2,000 years. And as a result of this, we need to look at history from a 30,000-foot perspective and have a conversation about this sharp barb. However, before we analyze the overall impact that Christianity has had on its history, we need to define properly what Christianity is and what it is not. So the basic tenet of Christianity is one that centers around the person of Jesus and what he did on the cross. The basics of it are this. By our nature, as imperfect beings, humans are separated from the God of the Bible, who is, by his nature, perfect and cannot fellowship with anything that is tainted from sin. To resolve this dire situation, God sends his only son, Jesus, to earth to live as 100% human and 100% God. Jesus lives this perfect, uncorrupted, sinless life, and then Jesus freely lays down his life where he's crucified on the cross for humankind's sins. Jesus then proves that he has power over death and life by rising from the dead. And Jesus, now having paid the penalty for sin himself, offers atonement with God because his sacrifice is for everyone and anyone who's willing to believe his message and receive the gift of salvation that he offers. So, in order to be a Christian, we affirm these few basic tenets: Jesus' death, burial, and physical resurrection. We then affirm the commands that Jesus gives to us: love God and love your neighbor as yourself. One of the best ways that we can function as people is by noticing the example that Jesus sets for us. We do so by examining his life and his ministry. One of the most important examples we see is the way that Jesus actually treats the marginalized. You see, the world that Jesus envisions is one where the power structures are upside down. Those who are first will be last, and those who are last will be first. This Bible verse underscores the lens by which Jesus lived his life, did ministry, and expected people who followed him to behave. Now, this by no means indicates that all things in which well-meaning Christians participate in are good. We make mistakes. However, it does indicate that if someone is genuinely following Jesus, they're going to try their best to love other people well. So now that we have an understanding about what Christianity is in a very simplified nutshell, let's take a look at what it's not. Christianity is not a power grab or a centralization of power for a few at the expense of the many. When we see Christians living out the example that Jesus set, we see that there are great things which happen in the world as a whole for all people. However, when we look at the negative examples of people who claim to be Christian, we see and understand that there are two different sets of lives that are being lived out by those who claim, perhaps falsely, to be followers of Jesus and those who actually are. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and look at a few examples. So our first consideration will be based on the early treatment of Christians towards non-followers of Jesus. It's important to remember that Christianity did not start off as being widely accepted. It was a minority religion for a few centuries before Emperor Constantine made it Rome's official religion. However, the impact that Christians were making was seen by emperors before Constantine for a couple hundred years. The Emperor Julian, who reigned around the year 360, like all emperors before him, he was Pontifex Maximus, which means he was the chief priest of the state religion of Rome. He wrote in a letter the following about Christians. Why then do we think that this is sufficient and do not observe how the kindness of Christians to strangers, their care for the burial of their dead, and the sobriety of their lifestyle has done the most to advance their cause? Julian goes on to write about the need for the Romans to erect a bunch of hostels so that there can be bread and wine for the poor. He states, "For it is disgraceful when no Jew is a beggar, and the impious Galileans," people he called Christians, "support our poor in addition to their own. Everyone is able to see that our co-religionists are in want of aid from us. Teach also those who profess the Greek religion to contribute to such services, and the villages of the Greek religion to offer the first fruits to the gods." You see, Christian groups have been taking care of the poor, regardless of their religious affiliation, for a couple hundred years now. They're following Jesus' example, and they have been doing it for long enough to the point that even the Roman emperors notice. Rodney Stark, author of The Rise of Christianity, argues that some of the marked growth of the early church in the early centuries can be attributed to the care and compassion that the Christians showed for the sick. He tracks increased conversion rates during the three plagues that occur. We have the Antonine Plague in the 2nd century, the Cyprian Plague in the 3rd century, and the Justinian Plague in the 6th. You see, Christians were different. They demonstrated their love for God and biblical values, and they offered a very attractive witness. Let's look at another example of Christian influence on the world. Christians have been leaders in medicine and in the building of hospitals because their founder, Jesus of Nazareth, healed the sick during his ministry on earth. You see that in Matthew 9, 10, and in other places. The early church not only endorsed medicine, but championed care for the sick. The apocryphal book Ecclesiasticus 38:1 serves as a reminder that medicine itself owes its origins to God. Honor the physician. From God, the physician gets wisdom. God brings forth medicines from the earth, and let a prudent man not ignore them. Admittedly, the Greeks and Romans made great contributions to early medicine, but as Albert Johnson, University of Washington historian of medicine, maintains, the second great sweep of medical history begins at the end of the 4th century with the founding of the first Christian hospital in Caesarea in Cappadocia, and concludes at the end of the 14th century with medicine well ensconced in the universities and in the public life of the emerging nations of Europe. You see, Christians were intimately involved in the development of hospitals. Johnson goes on to argue, during these centuries, the Christian faith, the very conception of medicine as well as its practice, was deeply touched by the doctrine and discipline of the church. This theological and ecclesiastical influence shaped the ethics of medicine, but it even indirectly affected its science, since as its missionaries evangelized the peoples of Western and Northern Europe, the church found itself in a constant battle against the use of magic and superstition in the work of healing. It championed rational medicine along with prayer to counter superstition. The very first official hospital in humankind was founded by Saint Basil of Caesarea, who founded the hospital in 369 AD. You see, Christian hospitals grew apace, spreading throughout both the East and the West. By the mid-1500s, there were 37,000 Benedictine monasteries alone that cared for the sick. Now, the point of discussing these two examples is to focus on the reality that is what Christianity is intended to be. Selfless living for the other, caring for the marginalized at the expense of the self, imitating Jesus' example to the point of dedicating your life to those who have been neglected by society. This is a tall order to live by. Now, with that being said, let's take a look at some negative examples to draw these comparisons out better. The first example is Constantine's marriage of the empire and Christianity. Now, I think this one serves as the biggest example across all time periods because this is where we first see the beginning of Christianity mixing itself with nationalism. Kind of like make Rome great again, right? It's crucial to remember that Christianity started as a way to literally be countercultural. The goal for followers of Jesus was to be different than the world around them. This is why Christianity explodes in the first few centuries. You see, Christians existed to live as this polis, or this separate city, that was different from the surrounding world. There were to be a light on the hill, if you've ever heard that Bible verse. Now, when we see Constantine mix empire and Christianity, we begin to see politics make their way into a movement where they were never meant to be. This is where subjugation starts to occur. This unhealthy mixing is what leads to brutal justifications for awful things like slavery, crusades, murder, extortion, on and on and on. Let me put it another way. Anytime Christianity mixes with nationalism, it is a deeply unhealthy mix that is antithetical to the way Christianity started and is meant to be practiced. Now, this isn't to say that Christians can't be in government or shouldn't be poli-sci majors at university and try and make an impact and make the world better. However, it is a warning to Christians who think that government is the primary tool by which God makes God's will known to the world. So the reality is this. When we see people begin to mix earthly power with kingdom living, we begin to move away from the heart of Jesus. We know that when Christianity is functioning right and at its best, we see things working well for all people in the world. Hospitals, schools, care centers, food banks, homeless shelters. More often than not, these places have their roots in a Christian desire to take God's command, which is love your neighbor as yourself, seriously. Now again, there will always be people who abuse the name of Christianity in an attempt to garner more power for themselves. This is important to watch out for. However, it should be obvious to spot. If someone is trying to ascertain higher seats of power for the sake of gain for the self, you can automatically know their motives are suspicious at best or antithetical to Christ at worst. So what do you think? What are some other ways you've seen Christians do good in the world? How about bad? Let me know, and until next time, I'll see you in the comments. That was chunky.